Welcome, everyone, to the Two Real Cinema Club. My name is Andres Lorente.
And I am James Rosica. And every episode on the Two Real Cinema Club, we watch two movies, a new movie and an old movie, and we try and connect the dots between the two. And this episode, so we're watching Blonde, the new Netflix originals feature, and comparing it with 1985's Insignificance by Nick Rogue. Double dose of blonde hair.
Yeah. Double dose of longish movies, too.
Yeah.
And sometimes here at the club, I think we take one for the team. So we watched some films, and we may have taken up a lot of hours of our time this weekend in order to save you a lot of your hours. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation for sure. But before we get started, let's talk about our socials. We can be found on Twitter at Two Real Cinema Club at twitter.com. Instagram, also Two Real Cinema Club at instagram.com. Read the blog where Jimmy does great writing and I never managed to actually successfully post anything. That's tworealcinemaclub.com. Email us if I can find the password or Jimmy can give us a new one. I'll check that. That's tworealcinemaclub at gmail.com. And tell your friends. Excitement is spreading, Jimmy, I think, because people are talking about Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And the audience is growing because we like talking, and I guess a small number of you like listening.
Some people like listening. There's someone else talking in the background as well, and you're having your house painted. I can hear the guy painting the house behind you.
Yes, the painters will be painting. There'll be foul language, most of it in Spanish, so I don't think it'll offend anyone, but they are on ladders right behind me, and they're listening to some great music, too, so they are singing and painting. It's just like a musical over here.
Well, we get the copyright strike. So let's talk about Blonde then. So a lot of publicity about this film. It has been on the internet and in the papers a lot in this country. So Blonde is the new feature film from Andrew Dominik. Now, I haven't seen any of his films before. I don't know whether you have.
I saw the very long-titled, long and slow film about someone was killed by Jesse James, the coward Jesse James. Or was it the Jesse James was killed by the coward something Ford? Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. And then I think his first film was Chopper.
Didn't see it.
Which introduced the world to Eric Bana. I haven't seen it.
Okay.
He directed Killing Them Softly about 10 years ago. Haven't seen it.
No.
And Blonde, so his current picture, first film for about 10 years. It's been in development for 10 years, based on a book written by Joyce Carol Oates.
Yeah.
Published 20 years ago, so published in 2000. So apparently he started developing the project in 2010. People were cast, people were uncast. Eventually, they started shooting in 2019. Then they got halfway through the shoot and something happened and they had to stop for a while. And eventually, so it's finally out now in the autumn of 2022. And it's a kind of, people are billing it as an alternative history. It's a biopic of Marilyn Monroe, 1950s, 1960s film star. I feel like when I was a boy, no one would need to explain who Marilyn Monroe is, but I haven't done a little survey. I don't know whether my children know who she is. I don't think she has the same currency with young people now that she did when I was young. She'd only been dead 20 years when you and I were young.
Yeah.
Whereas she's a much more historical figure now.
Well, she's been dead 60 years, so that makes you more historical because you're just longer dead. You're more dead than you used to be, so she's become more historical. And yes, it's a biopic, but it's definitely based on this fictional novel by Joyce Carol Oates. So it's fiction. It doesn't say that at the outset, which is different from the other film we watched this week.
Yep. So it's kind of admitting that it's a fiction, but only kind of one arm removed. So the story is the story of Norma Jean, the daughter of mentally unwell Gladys, and film opens with her as a girl living with her kind of unstable and much troubled mother. Gladys tells her daughter, Norma Jean, an impressionable 7-year-old, that her father is the man in a photo, it's a still from a movie. She implies that her father is a man who's a movie star and she can't say who it is. And one day she hopes that her daughter will meet her father. But it's all very vague and hush-hush, and she can't really bring herself to give any more details than that. There's a shocking opening scene with Los Angeles on fire. Gladys drives Norma Jean through the flames and through the ash having what looks like some kind of psychotic episode, convinced that she'll be able to make it to Norma Jean's father's house, and they get turned back by the police, who clearly identify that Gladys is not having a good night. All ends badly for Norma Jean. She's beaten up by her mother in the car, and then her mother attempts to drown her later on. It's a blooming awful opening, awful childhood for Norma Jean. Great job by the child actress who portrays her. But those first 10 or 15 minutes, pretty brutal, and a fairly representative clue of what we got to look forward to for the remaining 2 hours and 40 minutes of the film. So the young, impressionable Norma Jean ends up going to an orphanage, and then we jump forward and she becomes a model. She's on the front of magazines, and then she quickly becomes an actor. It's a tough gig for a young, attractive woman in Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s. She's raped at a go-see by someone who you have to presume is Daryl Zanuck, someone who's just called Mr. Z.
Mr. Z, yeah. I think we'll need to talk about the fact that no one gets really named in this film, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Which is in fact the same for both of them. Marilyn movies on the bill tonight. So she gets her start in showbiz through that, and she ends up in a three-way tryst with the son of Charlie Chaplin, Kaz Chaplin, and the son of Edward G. Robinson, Eddie Robinson. And the film feels like it's divided, I would say, into 5 chapters. And the chapters are all really based on the people that she is spending her time with. She has a chapter with her mother, a chapter with Chaplin and Robinson. She falls pregnant by one of them. And they have, there's a number of fairly racy scenes where they have sex in what looks like a fairground mirror, with their kind of crazy, distorted bodies. She falls pregnant, has a termination. Their friendship falls apart. So she meets and marries Joe DiMaggio, but his family sneer at her. They have no respect for her. He beats her in a fit of jealousy. They split up. She meets and marries Arthur Miller, but she rather feels that he thinks of her as a kind of... as more of material than as a person.
Slow down there, Razor. Sorry.
Am I racing ahead of myself?
You've dropped some names which I think you're not legally allowed to do. So it's the ball player and the playwright. You mentioned about something about 2 famous men who she may have, well, the real Marilyn Monroe may have been married to, but in the film, I think they're called the ball player and the playwright.
But I suppose in the film, the lead character is called Marilyn Monroe, and historically, the real Marilyn Monroe was really married to the real Joe DiMaggio and the real Arthur Miller.
Thank you.
So lawyers stand down. Either way, she goes through a number of unsatisfying relationships. When her relationship with the man who resembles Arthur Miller disintegrates, she becomes increasingly unstable. She's kind of raging on the set of Some Like It Hot. She's living a kind of druggy, alcoholic haze. She's shipped off to give John F. Kennedy a hand job while he watches The Twilight Zone. And eventually she takes her own life after Cass Chaplin, her original first lover, reveals that all the way through the movie she believes she's been receiving letters from her father, who she hopes to meet one day. And at the very end of the movie, Cass writes her a letter explaining that no, it was him pretending to be the father all along. The father didn't exist. She feels directionless, takes a bunch of barbiturates, takes her own life. The movie takes 2 3/4 hours to go through this relentlessly bleak, sorrowful, violent, unhappy story. And the UK press have largely labelled the film a horror movie.
Ooh.
Do you think that's a fair description?
I heard trauma porn, which I like a little bit more. I think that was the New York Times. Horror, it is in some ways, yeah. It's a horror bull movie. Does that make it a horror film? Yeah, for me, for 2 hours, 45 minutes, that does make it a horror movie. Yeah.
I mean, there is a lot of blood. There is a talking fetus. There is a lot of violence. I mean, pretty explicit violence.
Yeah.
If not necessarily horror, it's terror, like you say. I know we like to talk about writing on the pod, so I mean, it would be nice to try and focus on some aspects of the writing of the story, and I think there are good scenes in this film. I think there is a scene where she meets alleged Arthur Miller, and they have a discussion about the characters in his play, and about Chekhov. And I thought that was a nicely written scene. It's just a one-on-one scene, which I thought actually lent Marilyn's character a little bit of intellectual depth. I think there's a great scene where she meets Joe DiMaggio's family, who is kind of this family of Italians who are all just kind of like smirking and laughing at her and treating her as an underling. And she's kind of gamely doing her very best to fit in with her husband's new family. And I think that also is a skillfully written scene. There are some good scenes and some well-written scenes, but that's not really the norm, I think. There is a lot of not quite such hot writing in this film. There's a lot of talky writing, I think. A lot of too much dialogue. There's I had to write some of it down here. There's a scene with Arthur Miller where he says to her, "Every day since Maine, we're getting more and more distant. It's all the drink and drugs." They're not frightened about writing a scene where the characters explain in clear words exactly what the story is and what's happening.
Yeah, well, as a playwright, I guess a playwright does that because they have to tell the story a little bit more than a filmmaker does. But it's ironic that they've got the playwright, not Arthur Miller, but the playwright, telling us what happened in some earlier scene in some other place. It's a classic mistake, I think.
And there's a bunch of kind of terribly painful puns, I thought, actually. There's a scene that she's shooting where she has to hold a razor blade against her neck. And the director shouts, "Cut!" for the end of the scene. And we're supposed to be gobsmacked at the amazing irony of her holding a blade in her hand while someone says cut. Oh, isn't that incredible? Or one of the several scenes where she has a termination of pregnancy and she's driving in the back of the car and she goes past a stop sign. And she starts crying out, "Oh, no, wait, stop. I don't want to terminate the pregnancy." I did find a lot of that pretty painful.
Yeah. Oh, God, there's another one, too, which is... I don't even know if I should repeat it.
Oh, go on, repeat it.
Oh, so it's after I think she's had a moment with the president, and she's in the bathroom sort of recovering, and someone's knocking on the door, and she says, "Don't come inside."
Dear.
I don't think you would say that if you were on the toilet waiting and someone's knocking on the door. But you're right. You're paying very good attention to the puns. Yeah, it was hard to digest.
And it's a shame because I think there are a lot of elements of this movie which are pretty spectacularly great. But I don't think many of those relate to the script. I think the cinematography in this film is astonishing because it's incredibly mimetic. I feel like every famous still of the real Marilyn has somehow been... it's always been sort of deep faked. It's been recomposed into a moving image in front of us. It's something to do with the way the film stock and the lenses that they've used and the lighting really feels like some of these very famous photographs are just bursting out of the screen.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And then there's a bunch of kind of like clever trick shots. There's I think a lovely, elegant aeroplane trick shot where Marilyn, towards the end of her life, is kind of drunk and hazy, and she's on an aeroplane, but the aeroplane set has been built on the side of an auditorium set. So she gets up out of the aeroplane seat, and she's immediately in the auditorium for a theatre.
Yeah,
and it's been very cleverly set up, and it's a wonderful, clever little shot. Although they're so pleased with it that they then repeat it about 5 minutes later.
Yes, and the audience is actually she's walking back towards a standing ovation from this audience as she goes back to her plane seat, and she's just thrown up on the camera, basically. So the viewers have all been thrown up on, and then they give her a standing ovation for it. And I think that was emblematic of a lot of the film, honestly. It's just to key moment. For me, I mean, the biggest problem is that this is very much in terms of writing, and there is writing in there, and I've not read the Joyce Carol Oates book, so I don't know how similar it is to the novel. But it felt like a real director's film. Like he was trying so many different tricks, and it was just this experimental playground for him. And as a result, I felt like I was watching 6 or 7 different movies, and none of them were very good. And they were all very long. So, because there was a lot of inventive filmmaking in there. I'm just sorry that it was lost on such a gruesome tale. And I think, that first, it's not even the first act, but almost like the forward of it, or the prelude to the film, is her youth, which moves pretty quickly in terms of years. I mean, it's actually a very slow kind of opening. The first 10 or 15 minutes don't move that quickly, but we go quickly through her life. And I think, we're supposed to understand all that trauma early on so that we can understand her trauma throughout her life. But it seems like it's just dumping more and more trauma on. He's really pulling out all the most traumatic bits of her life and not really acknowledging that this was an intelligent woman and a very good actor. Certainly in a number of films she was great. And it really just sort of perpetuates this myth of her as a blonde bimbo and just so troubled and so pathetic. And I don't think we needed that again. I think we've seen that in films. And so as a result, I don't think it really doesn't hold together as a really complete film for me. It felt like a lot. I was watching a lot of different things. You're right. Some of it's brilliant, beautiful filmmaking, great cinematography. But in terms of telling me a good story about Marilyn Monroe or any actress, I don't think it does it, and it's just a shame that it does it within the context of a lot of people assuming this is really what her story was like.
It's a shame that she's kind of she's only really allowed to want 2 things, isn't it? Which is her father and a baby. And that's like the extent of her psychological motivation. And, yeah, she's allowed very little intellectual inner life. Which I think is much better done in our second film when we come to talk about Insignificance. But instead, I feel like she's just kind of pared down to either being a vessel for pain, or somebody who needs her daddy issues sorted out.
Sure.
Which is feels just like a real injustice to a complex and sophisticated real world character. She is kind of broadly used by those around her in the film, but I think she's also used by the camera and the audience in much the same way.
Yeah.
I think our viewing the film is only really reproducing the same kind of trauma that she's had to deal with in real life. What do you think the film is about? If you had to draw a line under a theme, what do you think is the theme that's going to come out here?
Well, there's been so much talk about the sex, and I was getting, feeds in my stream that I'm reading about Ana de Armas defending the sex scenes and Joyce Carol Oates doing that as well. And it to me, I think it's about sexploitation, and it's very funny that it takes a sexploitation film of today to explore the sexploitation of the 1950s and 60s. I mean, that's what I come away with. That's the biggest theme I take away with. It seems to be about a very anti-abortion perspective as well. I mean, this is a very anti-choice film. And it's certainly not about historical accuracy. So that's another thing that it's about.
I mean, there's the kind of the scene where the little fetus kind of talks to her and says, "Oh, please don't terminate me, Marilyn. Oh, it's so painful." It really feels like it belongs in a kind of, like a strange sort of religious fundamentalist cartoon to be shown to teenagers.
An abstinence film or something. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. A very strange tone to take.
Yeah.
And, and especially when you're dealing with cinema, it does annoy me that people making the film think that the best way to demonstrate this notion that a woman might really want a baby is for the baby to come and speak to her through her abdomen.
Yeah.
Whereas in the UK, at least, if any female member of the royal family even places her hand on her abdomen at any point during any public visit, the UK press takes off with a massive campaign about, is Kate pregnant? It's one of those thoughts which is so easy to transmit with a little bit of physical acting. It's such a strange way to over-egg the pudding by demonstrating that somebody wants a baby by having a talking baby inside them.
Yeah.
I was wondering, kind of the same as you, why is this film being made now? Why are we exploring this traumatic and challenging life of Marilyn Monroe in 2022? I was trying to figure out who would be 2022's equivalent of Marilyn Monroe, and I don't think there is one. I think in today's world, Marilyn is both everyone and no one. I don't think there is a single overarching international star who's held up above all others to be, the archetype of desirable femininity. And I think, if you live in an urban area these days, you're never more than 50 meters away from someone who's got an OnlyFans page, aren't you? I think this kind of notion of being a kind of a professional sex pot has been democratized to the nth degree now. And the internet means that, actually anyone can be a professional sex pot. It's, the option is there for the taking.
Yeah, so that responsibility is not held by one famous actress alone.
Yeah, exactly. So it makes you think, well, why? So what is this film about now?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think there's so much sex and there's so much consequences of sex. I guess the pregnancies, the abortions, that it sort of has this inelegant marriage between sexploitation and potentially the risks of leading that very, very sexy life or something like that. I don't think it juggles it very well because it's so grotesque on both ends. Like the sex is very, very brutal, and then the abortion scenes are very, very brutal. So it's rough. I mean, I think that's probably what it almost does feel like this sort of this sort of I don't know, would the word be? I mean, this sort of study of sex and its consequences, I guess.
That feels like, straight back to the 1950s.
Doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, it really felt like that to me in many ways, yeah.
As a British viewer, it was interesting to see John F. Kennedy turn up in a very unsympathetic light. I kind of, like watching it from the UK, there's no kind of great mysticism surrounding John F. Kennedy. And it does feel a little bit like he is maybe due his Me Too moment. I wonder whether there will be this is the beginning of a reckoning on John F. Kennedy's legacy, and actually maybe having sex with all those women wasn't necessarily like the best way to promote your progressive democratic ideals. Yeah. I don't know what does John F. Kennedy look like to the average man on the street in the States these days?
A lot better than our current and recent past alternatives as president, probably. But I think he was a fairly well-known philanderer, and this episode with Marilyn Monroe is pretty common knowledge. It was striking though, and I think one thing I was going to come back to is just that this film, as you said earlier, was developed sort of before Me Too. And I wonder if it was rewritten at all for this moment. So if you're saying like for this moment, I feel like this film kind of either probably just came too late. It seems out of place. I know that it was written around 2011, 2012. I think Jessica Chastain was originally expected to play Marilyn, and I'm sure now she's very happy she didn't take that job or have to do it. But it is definitely very pre-Me Too, and so it feels, and at the same time, it just happens to come out when abortion's such a hot topic over here right now. So its timing is like oddly perfect, but at the same time, it seems like the wrong movement for the moment, or the wrong film for the moment. I'm wondering if there were rewrites, starting around 2017 or 2018 to change it. It doesn't feel like there were any changes. It doesn't seem up to date in that way.
I mean, I think the whole film, it's structurally very loose. It feels to me a little bit like a rough cut. It comes in at just under 3 hours. Yeah. And I feel like actually maybe there's quite an interesting 90-minute film in there. But, it still needs another 4 months of people to edit and maybe do a couple of reshoots and try and find the film, that's hiding at the core there.
Yeah. I think I was just going to mention another theme that I think that we'd be remiss if we didn't mention. I think so much of it's about male gaze and male control of that industry at that time, and again, sexploitation. And I think that part does seem poignant to me because that is very, very post Me Too. I mean, that we're looking more critically at males in general. There are a lot of scenes in this film. There's one of the film openings that she's entering in, and all the people in the crowd are men just sort of gawking at her as she walks into the theater for a film premiere. And, as you said before, like a new look at even John F. Kennedy, who probably today would have been run out of office. It's kind of interesting because, we're really worried about presidents' private lives here. Bill Clinton was impeached for sexual acts in the Oval Office with someone other than Hillary, his wife. But and John F. Kennedy was kind of celebrated for it. So in in the 20 or 30 years between those two presidents, a lot seems to have changed. But now we have to go back and I think reassess JFK and how we felt about him before. So.
I'm glad you mentioned that scene about kind of the men baying at her as she goes into the premiere, because that was one of the most horrifying scenes. Actually, I came away thinking, have the men been digitally altered somehow? They seem to have these kind of enormous mouths and these kind of wriggling tongues.
Yeah,
it was just something which is just. Maybe it was just casting men with big mouths, but there was just something very disturbing about that sequence.
I agree with you. I think that was probably my favorite scene because at first you just see the men gawking and booing and catcalling and shouting. And then eventually you see the limo with the playwright and Marilyn Monroe pulling up to the premiere. And you're right, every one of those faces looked like a 1950s or 60s man's face. You had the pork pie hats and all that. And none of those guys looked like they were, like recent actors or even alive today. It was really brilliant. I don't know how they did that, but I think it was just great extras casting. It's a dark crowd. There's no one wearing anything colors. It's one of the black and white scenes. And there's not a woman to be seen. And that was one of the best moments of the film because I think that did capture the theme of the whole film. It's just this leering, this gawking, this male gaze everywhere.
There's one other thing the film made me think of, and I'll just kind of indulge me here. I don't know whether you remember Sandra Dickinson, who was she was an American actor who was kind of very mildly successful in the UK, like in the 1980s, and she was in the UK. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy television series, and she was married to Peter Davidson, who was a Doctor Who for a while. She was kind of headed a mildly successful sort of TV and film career in the UK, and she was a small American woman, very blonde hair, and she used to really trade on having this kind of breathy Marilyn type voice. Yeah, and whenever you saw her, she'd always have the same kind of sort of little girl lost, sexy girl, sort of breathy voice. And I remember as a boy seeing her on a quiz show. She was on like a celebrity quiz show. And the other kind of guests, the other celebrities on the quiz show were all sort of slightly ribbing her and all making jokes at her expense. And eventually it got to the point where she came out of character and she said in her non-breathy little voice, like just a perfectly normal adult woman's voice, she said, "Okay, that's enough now." And that little moment where the Sandra Dickinson that I'd seen on telly before suddenly disappeared and you were afforded this tiny little glimpse into the fact that there was a real woman in there who was just doing a voice as a character all the way through. Yeah. It's like just letting the veil drop for a moment. Yeah. That was like really revealing. And that was the moment I was waiting for in this film. Well, yeah. Because Marilyn uses her kind of her breathy little girl voice all the way through the movie. Yeah. I feel as if she's never allowed to let that veil drop. Yeah. And for we, the audience, I mean, even her mental voice, even when she's speaking to herself, it's always that same kind of sort of breathy stage voice. She's never allowed to see the real woman. Well, there are a couple moments. I think there's an early audition or an early screen test. Sorry about the motorcycle or airplane or whatever. There's an early screen test where she's doing, looks like a great screen test, honestly. But she starts, I think she opens by talking about Dostoevsky. And the guys immediately, the director and the assistant director, they never give her a chance. They dismiss her immediately. She says, "Oh, she's just pathetic," or whatnot. And then later on, when she's talking to the playwright, she's talking about Chekhov a little bit and comparing his play to a Chekhov play. And that's when you see the non-breathy voiced and the I don't know, fully brained Marilyn, not the half-wit that comes through in much of the film, sadly. So you do see her humanity a couple times, but it's not much. It's much more about her being used by the industry or used by men. And I think that's why it makes it a very incomplete portrait of her. It was a rough film for me. And you're right, there were some great shots, and one of the great ones was the reproduction of the famous over the subway vent shot where her white dress is blowing up. But the amount of time they spent on it just sort of, it made us all these peeping Toms to a certain extent, because
it was probably a minute or 2 minutes of just the skirt going up and down and up and down. And again, you had more male gaze all around. And it just seemed, it was ironic to me that in trying to, like, I think, expose the sexism in the industry for so many years, you've got this completely sort of sexploitation sequence of a very famous scene and just really overdoing it. And I think that's a lot of it was the film, for me, there was just a lot of overdoing things and really kind of doing too much. There were so many different camera techniques. There's one point where Bobby Cannavale's wearing the camera and walking through the house, and then later on, Marilyn's wearing the camera. We haven't talked about...
Sometimes it feels like a series of camera tests rather than a film, doesn't it, somehow?
Yeah, what about... I couldn't make out... I was having a hard time figuring out why you're going color sometimes and why you're black and white and why is the aspect ratio changing so frequent?
That infuriates me. That takes me right out of the picture.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating. I could see no valid story reason for that. It felt, self-indulgent and silly. One last thing.
Yeah.
Do you think it's appropriate to phone the Cliche Squad?
You could probably do it again and again.
Cliche Squad.
Can I share mine first? You obviously have one, so I'm gonna try and beat you to one.
Because I must say, this it's one thing for you to present your central character as having daddy issues, but if she's going to call every single man that she meets daddy in every goddamn scene, maybe you have over-egged that pudding. Yeah. That's my theory. That's my feeling.
Yes. Okay. The one or ones that I thought of were unanswered telephones and unanswered knockings on the doors. That happened so many times, and it was just. I don't know, was this supposed to be opportunity again and again? The final cliche was probably the best one when she sort of disappears as a star among countless stars in this, empty, dark vacuum of space, and she's just indistinguishable despite the fact that she lived such a, memorable life that we're still talking about 60 years later. It was that one wasn't so bad.
Right, I think we've assassinated poor Marilyn enough.
Yes.
Let's have a quick break, and then maybe we'll come back and talk about a different Marilyn film. Let's see what we've got to say. Okay, see you in a minute.
Yeah.
Andres, I've got good news for you now. Not only are we film critics, but I'm happy to say the Two Real Cinema Club is also going to go into video game publishing.
Whoa. Tell me more.
Absolutely. So now that Netflix are publishing video games, we're going to get on the bandwagon and do the same thing. I'm happy to announce this autumn we'll be releasing our first video game, which is Film Critic Simulator. You'll be able to play it on mobile or on PC. You'll start out negotiating a maze of Soho streets, trying to buy lukewarm coffee while looking for a doorway that's entirely unmarked, which is the screening room. Once you make it in, then it'll be a lot like a normal film screening, only it'll be interrupted every 2 or 3 minutes by you having to make notes. You'll see whether you've got the skill to not drop your pen and use your phone to light up a bit of foolscap in your lap, and maybe drop the phone, maybe drop the pen and drop the phone, drop the pen, use your phone to try and find the pen, then drop the phone. And then there's bonus marks at the end of that round if you can read your own writing.
Oh, yeah.
And basically, we'll be using all of the very latest techniques in realism and video game technology to suck all the pleasure out of watching a film. And finally, if you play using surround sound headphones, we've managed to get a sample of Derek Malcolm, who'll be standing directly behind you, complaining throughout that the film is shit. It's only $39.99 coming out this autumn.
Wait, pounds? Or dollars?
Or dollars. Pounds are worth less than dollars now,
right.
aren't they?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Buy it in dollars what you can, I think.
I'll pay either one. If someone will do all that work for me, please. You made me feel like my life is just a game. And we are back for a double dose of the blonde. We're going to look next at Insignificance, which is, I think, 1985 film directed by Nicholas Roeg.
Before we talk about Insignificance, I got to wait. It's a triple dose of a blonde, isn't it? Because
Oh my God.
we didn't get around to talking about it for blonde, but you've written a Marilyn script, haven't you?
I have written a Marilyn script. Yes, I was asked to do it by our good friend and co-collaborator, Zis Papatzikis.
But you must have been writing that about the same time they were developing Blonde.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, because I finished it around beginning of 2011, 2010, end of 2010, yeah. Haven't gone back to it and looked at the draft recently, but it was a lot of fun because it's technically going to be, it's supposed to be an animated film of Marilyn Monroe's life. And sort of zeroing in on that like 1960s area as well, but some backstory and whatnot. But when he gave me the go-ahead to sort of think of it as an animated picture, I think that was a very liberating experience because you can sort of make anything happen. And I think he still really wants to get it made. I think with Marilyn Monroe, you get these like 5-year, maybe 6-7 year cycles where you'll hear nothing and then you'll hear a couple of films come out, see a couple of things come out. So there was the last cycle. Didn't Eddie Redmayne have a film where he was a sound person or a gaffer, or he was on a crew working with Marilyn Monroe? And I wanted to say that was the Michelle Williams one, but I'm not sure. And then there was a documentary at the same time. And right now we've got Blonde on Netflix. I don't know if there's something else out there or not, but it seems like every few years there's something new that comes out. So she gets a good long look every once in a while. But Foxy, which Zesis came to me with, so he had a lot of work already done, all the conspiracy theories and things like that. And he sort of gave me a pretty good outline, but then I went back and read some biographies of her and Arthur Miller and others and pieced the story together. So he gave me a lot of freedom, which was fun. It was a blast to write, honestly.
Did you go fairly crazy with it?
To a certain extent, yeah, because I wanted to place her in the context of all the stuff that was going on right around her death. So it was like the Cuban Missile Crisis was right around that time.
Yeah.
Andy Warhol was coming out, so we always imagined this sort of Roy Lichtenstein kind of pop art animation look. So that was really fun because, in terms of the movies and the art and the politics of the time, it was a lot of fun. So, and people like Bing Crosby are involved in there. Che Guevara has a line of dialogue. Frank Sinatra. So, there were just so many people around her, and she was sort of this focal point with the Kennedys as well. So, there were just so many interesting characters that I was able to sort of bring in one way or another. And I think that's why Zesis thinks she's such an important figure, because she was really right at the center of politics, art, and film industry. So that's why she's got this sort of lasting influence, I think. And there were some great possibilities. So I hope that someday he will make it. I think it's the kind of thing where animation isn't necessarily super, super expensive if you've got a really committed crew to do it. So I think he could possibly make it happen. So
yeah, it sounds a lot more interesting than Blonde.
Yeah. Well, I think here you get a little bit of the mafia interest and maybe some Herbert Hoover in Blonde, but Foxy, we did a lot more of that. So that's why that Castro would come in and whatnot, because they were sort of so focused on the assassination of Kennedy and Robert Kennedy as well, getting involved with Marilyn Monroe, which was not in Blonde, and just the whole political edge to it. So she was a bright woman. She was definitely involved in politics and as well as in theater and in film. So, she's just an interesting character, and I don't think either one of these films does her a great amount of justice. So
there is a bit of politics in Insignificance. So let's talk about Insignificance then. Okay.
So as I said, written by Terry Johnson, felt really like a mid-'80s film. Stars Teresa Russell as the actress, Tony Curtis, who's actually kind of in Blonde as the senator, Gary Busey as the ball player, and Michael Emile as the professor. And these are stand-ins for Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn Monroe, and of course Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
Sort of takes place in New York City. It's really the one night of the famous 7-year Itch sidewalk shoot, which was a very important night in film history. I think that whole shoot was basically a publicity stunt for the film, and this is, of course, where she stands over the subway grate and has the air blown up upon her and takes her skirt up into the air. It's funny. I don't know if they used that footage or if they probably reshot it somewhere in a studio. Because as I recall, it was mostly you wouldn't shoot a scene like that on an open set in the middle of New York City. So I believe that they just wanted to drum up some publicity for the film, and they did this sort of as a stunt. This is an interesting film. I don't think it's a biopic at all. I mean, what I liked about this film is at the outset it says there's a disclaimer at the beginning. I think it just said this film is fictitious or this film is a work of fiction, which Blonde does not do. It's sort of a Marilyn film. She's kind of the protagonist, but those other three characters are kind of equally important in bits and pieces. In short, the senator, which is Tony Curtis, he visits this professor who's staying in a hotel, and he is supposed to appear before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. I guess it's in Washington, D.C. This is taking place in New York City.
Yep.
So he wants to interview him about they want to interview him. Is he a communist, or does he know any communists? It's sort of that fervor of the time. So definitely set in the 1950s. And New York City is a very small place in this film because they're all kind of in the same area just by chance. I think I'd read that it was possible that these people could have known each other. I guess Tony Curtis is the senator supposed to be the Eugene McCarthy character, but whether they would have interacted in this way is completely fictional.
I did read that Terry Johnson said that apparently after Marilyn died,
Yeah.
a signed photograph of Albert Einstein was found among her possessions.
Yeah.
And that was the notion that set the kind of the original play in
Yeah,
motion.
great. And one of the sort of the Act One curtain. There's this thematic statement about. I think she says she's had the best conversation of her life with Albert Einstein. So I think, I think they probably did have a good conversation. Again, she was a bright woman, so all these things which belittle her intelligence just drive me crazy. But ultimately, she goes to visit the professor shortly after the senator leaves, after she's had this crazy shoot on the streets of New York City, and she's escaped before her husband at the time, the ball player, possibly Joe DiMaggio, is left behind. She scoots off into the city, buys some items, and then goes with her items of like rocket ships and cars and little toy soldiers. She goes to the professor's hotel room. She knows where he is for some reason. And she explains the theory of relativity to Einstein, or the professor, which is a long, sort of talky scene, but quite interesting. So putting these two characters together.
I mean, I think it's by far the most interesting scene in the film.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would say it's like it feels like it's the centerpiece, really.
Yeah.
This is the reason that the film exists, and everything else is either getting to this point or observing the fallout from this point.
Precisely, yeah. It's a fairly reasonable explanation of the theory of relativity, I would say. She seems to be having some sort of identity crisis, and I like this part of the film in that she's only seen as a sex symbol. She's not seen for her mind, and the professor actually can see her for her intelligence. But there's a lot of, I think, real world versus imagined world or alternative universe sort of study going on in this film. They are definitely, stand-ins for the real people, but just in a formation or a grouping that you would never really see them. The professor is sloppy. He's unkempt. He looks exactly like Einstein. And Marilyn's beautifully put together, made up, and blonde and breathy as you'd expect her to be. I'd say at the end of the first act, the professor lets the actress stay in the hotel room that night, which is kind of controversial because she's married and he's supposed to appear before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. But they do say, this is a great conversation. It's not going to be anything sexual necessarily, but she does spend the night in his apartment. There were no real stakes as far as I could see in this film. It sort of like passes by as this sort of meditation on life and interactions with other humans, but I couldn't, there's some stakes with Marilyn's marriage, I guess, with the ball player Joe DiMaggio, but there was no tension like carrying you through this film, really. If there is some tension, it comes when DiMaggio gets to the hotel room. He's asked his driver, I guess, to take him where Marilyn went, and they go to the hotel. He's able to find the professor's room, and he finds Marilyn Monroe with the professor, and that leads to some tension there.
I mean, this is just at the moment, isn't it, when they're about to go to bed together? I
Yeah.
think so. He just diffuses that. It's kind of, I think, the two characters the film is really interested in are Einstein and Marilyn, and the others are.
Yeah.
The film isn't nearly as interested in them.
Precisely.
But they have this kind of this quite sweet relationship. I just wrote down like one little interaction here, which I thought kind of summarized it really well, which is not long after the two of them meet, Marilyn explains to Einstein how humiliated she felt having to do the scene for 7-Year Itch with his skirt blowing up around her hips. She asks him, she says, all these men were gawping at me, and she asks him, would you have watched? And instead of just being kind of chaste and said, oh no, I would have looked away, Einstein, he asks her, would you have liked me to?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which I think is like it's a very sweet response, because he's a man and he's in a hotel room with Marilyn Monroe, and clearly he finds her very attractive, but he's just offering her the agency which no one else will, where he's kind of saying, well, I know what I would like, but what's your opinion on whether you are watched or not? Yeah. That's the important part of the discussion. I thought that was kind of very sweet. And, initially he's being very, he's being a bit coy, and he's saying, oh, we shouldn't do this. And eventually, she kind of persuades him, well, what the hell? Why don't we sleep together? And then, that's the moment when Joe DiMaggio comes up.
I never for a moment thought that they would sleep together, but the setup is there. And I think we're supposed to assume that they would, because that makes DiMaggio's entrance that much more menacing, I suppose. And in all of this, the senator disappears for a long time, but he's in another hotel room where he's visited by a Marilyn Monroe lookalike call girl, and there's this sort of bizarre sex that happens there. But yeah, you're right. I mean, DiMaggio's not there. He's in a bar for much of the film, and the senator is kind of in this other hotel room with this bizarre sexual experience in another place. So they are sort of left behind, and then Marilyn and the professor sort of take the leads here. So the ball player mistakes the professor for another psychiatrist, which again sort of subtly pokes at the fact that maybe the actress has some sort of mental health issues. But one thing that caught me was that the actress and the ball player, Marilyn and DiMaggio, agree to divorce sort of at one moment, and they know this person who can help them get a divorce. That's what I got out of it. And I know that divorce was less common and sort of a little harder to do at that time. So I guess that makes sense. But she sort of so they've agreed to divorce. They sort of get back together a few minutes later, like they're gonna be in love again. It's interesting because the context of this night in particular, I think Blonde the other film does a pretty good job of it, because Joe DiMaggio actually allegedly did beat Marilyn Monroe up quite a bit after that show. After that shoot, because he was so embarrassed by her being so public and exposed that way. This film, you don't get that menace at all. It's much more like, oh, we're going to get divorced now. They sort of briefly get back together. And I think one thing to mention that's pretty important is that all of these four principal characters have these sort of extensive flashback moments throughout the film. For the professor, he remembers his time in Europe under the Nazis. And he also has these images of Japan and the atomic bomb going off, so that he's wrestling with his guilt from the past. Similar to Blonde, there's a lot of sort of past trauma that sort of influences the current story. Marilyn, I think her experiences were mostly in the orphanage, where she put on these little sex shows, or these little girly shows for the boys in the orphanage. DiMaggio playing baseball as a kid, and he sort of was looking for the approval, I think, of a father figure is what I took from that.
Yeah.
And then the senator being sort of sexually abused by a priest when he was young. So there's all this past trauma sort of floating around in the present. And it's usually done through just flashbacks. But we do get that exposition that way.
They're kind of quite theatrical, stagey flashbacks, aren't they, as well?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot happening. They're not short flashbacks. It's not like you just get a quick image. It's more like you get a 20, 30-second sort of dreamy kind of flashback. They're done pretty well. But they are heavy exposition, I guess. There's a couple crazy scenes where the actor Will Sampson, who was Chief Bromden from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is in an elevator, and he starts telling the professor that the professor himself is a Cherokee, and he's sort of inspiring the professor to rethink things, I guess. It's an interesting role. It's not like he was a hot actor at that time, but he was very big in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he's got a couple scenes where he sort of challenges the professor to his thinking, and then he goes upstairs on the roof of the rooftop of this hotel in New York City and sort of does some singing and chanting and about it. But it's an interesting cameo, and I think that's what it's supposed to do, is to get the professor thinking about things. The senator arrives. He's going to take the professor to the hearings, but he finds the actress in the professor's bed. It's funny because there's not a lot for these actors to do. They're all playing famous people, but they're not really given a ton in the script to do throughout the film. So it's a little strange. The senator actually sort of challenges Marilyn quite a bit, and then he ends up punching her in the stomach. And this, I think the idea is that she gets a miscarriage in the process. She's in the bathroom. She's sort of bleeding out at the same time. So she's losing one of her dreams. The professor throws all of his papers representing his life's work, all these equations and sort of developing the theory of relativity. He just takes this stack of papers and throws them to the streets of New York City. And at the same time, because of the miscarriage, I think that gives the actress the permission structure to leave the ball player. So then they are going to divorce. They agree to see their lawyer friend. The actress sort of ends up angry at the professor and his again, that guilt of his role in developing the atomic bomb comes to the surface. He feels guilty. And then it sort of ends with this imaginary nuclear Armageddon that burns up the actress and seemingly everything. And that's sort of the resolution. And I'm not sure. It's funny because they're reaching these places of peace, I guess, or resolution, but at the same time, it comes through destruction, which is, I think that's sort of a classic theme in a lot of mythology and literature. So it makes sense to me, but at many times I felt like this film might just be way too smart for me. There's a lot going on. It's a meditation on memory, I think, and how memory makes us who we are. I think that's what a lot of the trauma from youth was about. But I couldn't figure it out beyond that. It's not a great film. I don't think I would recommend it for people to go out and spend. Probably it's an hour and 45 minutes or something like that. I don't know that the script could be a great film. That's the other thing. It's a crazy idea. It's a wonderful idea. I'm glad they tried it, but I don't know that it could have been fantastic. And I actually think Blonde could have been a fantastic film, and I don't think this film could have been. So it was interesting to see the two scripts. I preferred this film to Blonde, but I don't think either one of them actually is a very good film. And I don't think with the script as it was, I don't think this one could be. But what do you think?
I mean, Insignificance started life as a play, and it really, really looks it, doesn't it? Because it all effectively happens in one set, doesn't it? It all happens in Einstein's hotel room, and they put a tiny amount of effort in, don't they, to try and expand the story out. So there's a tiny amount of location shooting on New York streets at the beginning, and I suspect the scenes with the elevator operator are also scenes that have been added in the hope of maybe expanding the story outside just a tiny amount.
Okay.
I haven't seen the original play, but I strongly suspect it is 4 characters in one hotel room.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, it goes through some interesting themes, doesn't it? It does talk about Einstein's guilt and about Joe DiMaggio's disappointment and Senator McCarthy's kind of bitterness, and and it all wraps up in this kind of envelope of the fear of nuclear war. And in 1985, that was like a super, super big thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember in 1985 being, feeling convinced that there was a 50-50 chance that we'd all be there by this time next year.
Yeah.
That the threat of somebody dropping a bomb on London was very plausible, and it was something that teenagers talked about a lot. Doesn't seem so contemporary an idea now.
Well,
watching the film in 2020.
Could happen.
Okay, yeah.
It's a little bit more plausible now, but yeah, I agree with you. I do remember living under that fear of nuclear war happening at any moment.
And the very, very last line in the movie where Marilyn, she tells Einstein, "Oh, don't worry about the bomb, because the people who own the bombs are also the people who own all the buildings." And So, they're never going to drop a bomb because they'll lose all that money.
Yeah.
And she was saying, the only way they'd ever consider dropping a bomb is if somehow somebody managed to invent a bomb that would kill people and not destroy buildings.
Mm.
And in 1985, this notion of the neutron bomb was still like a very, very modern, new, contemporary idea. So this notion that there was a bomb that would kill the people and not the buildings was, very, very current. And it feels like, that's the kiss off of the movie. That's kind of so underlined by the script that I'm left kind of thinking, well, God, is that what the whole thing is about?
Mm.
Is it almost as if to say that the people's struggles that are going on in this film, people worrying about, whether they will have a family, whether they will have a divorce, whether their life's work means anything, whether they're bringing order to the world or not, maybe all of that is largely irrelevant when you live under the shadow of, the potential for the destruction of everything and everyone in a moment.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that is what the insignificance of the title is. But whether it works as a film is a perfectly good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd never seen a Nick Rogue film before I watched this as a teenager.
Yeah.
And I remember being quite surprised and shocked by the sudden dream sequences and the almost sort of abstract, fleeting memories that invade kind of seemingly at random.
Yeah.
And it's only after I saw another couple of Nick Rogue films, I thought, oh, right, that's what he always does then. I get it now. Nobody else really quite makes films like that, do they? You have to admire someone who develops a style and sticks with it.
Yeah. Well, boy, Blonde, Andrew Dominik sort of made a film too where there were these random moments that cut into the life of the actress, of Marilyn Monroe. So I think there's I'm not going to say that he does that all the time because I don't know his work very well, but yes, these two films are similar in that way, and I think it has to do with something of they both feel a little untethered and they sort of suffer from a lack of context. I think that's the thing. So both of these films can have these floating scenes because they're already kind of floating. They're not really attached to anything in reality to begin with, and I think for me it was a little disorientating as a viewer to see both of these films because I never felt like I had the right context to actually sit down and enjoy them for what they were meant to be.
At least Marilyn, the character, is allowed some agency in this film.
Yeah,
She's allowed to have this kind of rich inner life.
Yeah, precisely.
I think that the standout scene and the one that I remember is the one where she explains special relativity to Einstein.
Yeah.
And what I really appreciate is the way that Einstein, he listens to her explanation.
Yes.
And he has enough respect for her at the end to explain to her that although she thinks she understands it, she doesn't. And that it's, that seeing what the consequences of the theory are is not the same as understanding what it is. And if you don't know the maths, you don't understand the theory.
Yeah.
But I like the way that he doesn't patronize her and say, oh, well done, you got it right. He treats her as an intellectual equal and he says, well, that was great, but actually you don't understand it for these reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It's just nice to see her get a bit of respect and kudos, isn't it?
Yes, and the entire time that she's explaining, he's sort of giddy and, he mutters a few things here and there, but he really lets her explain the whole thing to him, and he's smiling, and I think he really loves the fact that he's reached at least one person, and she's not one of the little people or the normal people, but she is one human being who understands his theory and can explain it back to him. So I did like that scene. The film really centers around that scene in particular. When you were talking about the buildings and people, though, I did have an idea, because I feel like that's in some ways the exact opposite of the desires of our overlords. I think actually if you destroy buildings, that means you have to rebuild the buildings, and you need people to buy the things and pay the rents or buy the buildings or buy the things that go into the buildings. So ironically, I think if that's kind of the theme, it sort of misses, because I think the rule of the world, the rule of capitalism, I think, is to destroy some stuff or create stuff that's not going to last or is going to be destroyed so that you can make it again and again and again.
You sound like someone who's read 1984 recently.
Oh, God, I'd love to. Yeah. It hasn't been that long, but not too recently. But yes, absolutely. So it is, it does place well in the 1980s, because those are the sorts of things that we were thinking about. 1985 is not very far from 1984, clearly. So I think the nuclear Armageddon was definitely on our minds, and that really is what this sort of leads up to bit by bit. I mean, you see it a bit more coming with the Albert Einstein reminiscences, but he definitely ends up with it. This one ends in fire. There's a lot of fire in Blonde too, but this one ends up with it. And I think Blonde had more fire in the beginning, although, boy, there was a fire during one of her abortions, I think.
Oh, God, there was. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
37 years between these films.
Yeah.
Do you think we've learned anything about Marilyn Monroe in those 37 years that means she gets a better deal now than she used to?
I don't think she got a better deal on either of these films, really. She gets, and I want to apologize to you because it was sort of my idea to watch Blonde. I think I saw it was coming out. I had this script in my back pocket. I've been a Marilyn fan in some ways and studied her. And I'm just sorry. I'm sorry, Jimmy, that I asked you to watch that film. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes. And then I'm also sorry because I think Marilyn gets a better deal when you see something like Some Like It Hot or Gentlemen Prefer Blondes.
Right, yeah.
You had at one point suggested, hey, let's watch Some Like It Hot. And you see a few clips of them making that. And even those clips are not very fair to her performance, and I don't think they're very accurate because she really throws some tantrums in those scenes. But those are great films. So, I mean, I think to really get a good appreciation of Marilyn, go watch her films. Do not watch these biopics. And I think biopics more often than not are too loyal to the subject, and you can't get away with it. And these two are both kind of not loyal enough, and they don't take her seriously enough. They don't really pretend to be true stories, but they sort of reap the benefits of being inextricably linked to her true stories. So they both feel a little disingenuous in that sense, but I would say that Insignificance gives her a much better treatment than does Blonde, which Blonde it does feel exploitative and just like a sexploitation film.
Yeah. If you want the real deal, go to the source.
Yeah.
That's the answer then.
I think
go
so.
to the source.
Yeah.
Go to the source. Okay, we've just got time for also playing at this theatre. What's also playing at the theatre at the moment? What have you seen?
I have seen 5 films this week.
Oh, and you've been busy.
The 2 that we've just discussed were by far the worst, so I'm going to recommend 2 films that people will have a hard time finding. But they are definitely worth it. One is called Taming the Garden. I don't remember the name of the director. She probably is Georgian because it's a treatment of the former Prime Minister of Georgia, who is sort of buying up trees, ancient trees in some cases, 200, 300-year-old trees, from villages in Georgia to put them in his own garden. And it's spectacular. Another film called The Territory, which is a treatment of indigenous peoples in Brazil, as the rainforest around them is sort of being chopped down or burned up. More fire. And then, spoiler alert, we are going to talk about Nicholas Roeg again in our next podcast, but I saw Moon Age Daydream, which is the David Bowie biopic.
Ah, excellent.
Which we will pair soon, coming to podcasts near you. Well, this podcast near you. In a couple weeks, we'll pair that with Nick Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth. Featuring David
exciting.
Bowie. What about near you?
The only thing that's been playing near me, not nearly so intellectual and interesting. We watched Oblivion, the Joseph Kosinski picture with Tom Cruise in from about 2013. So we family all sat down and watched that.
Okay.
And it's no secret how much of an admirer I am of Tom the Cruise, but this film, fantastic production design. And a story that pretty much works, but it relies on one of my least favourite tropes, which is people not telling each other important plot details. Yeah. So once again, it's a story which works because one of the characters doesn't tell anybody one important bit of information, which she easily could have done, and then that would have made the film only 40 minutes long.
Yeah.
Annoys me when films rely on that. But hey, it's great production design.
Okay.
Right, this has been the Two Real Cinema Club. Join us next week for a popcorn counter, and then we will be back in 2 weeks' time with more Nick Roeg. It'll be the regular Nick Roeg Cinema Club. Join us. Until then, see you.
See you, everybody.